Okay, so let's begin by imagining a situation. Imagine you've just arrived in Edinburgh for the first time. You haven't been before. And you want to know, first things first, where your hotel is. You step off the train and want to find the right way. Assume also that it's 1993, so you don't have a phone with a GPS to point you in the right way. How are we going to find out? How are you going to find out where your hotel is? Well, it looks like the obvious thing to do is to ask somebody. That seems to be not only the obvious thing to do, but it seems to be the thing that you're supposed to do. Asking people and listening to what they say and believing what they say is a way of finding things out. And the epistemology of testimony, which I'm interested in, is the study of how it is that we come to find things out by asking people and believing what they say. It looks, first of all, like a lot of what we take ourselves to know or have found out does depend on believing other people somehow. I mean, in my case, I take it that I know that the Battle of Agincourt was in 1415, but I wasn't there to see it particularly. I can't remember it happening. My memory doesn't stretch back that far. I take it that I know the capital of Uganda is Kampala, but I've never actually been to Uganda. I take it that I know this because, well, someone told me. And I take it that Neptune has 14 moons, but I haven't seen any of them. I haven't even seen Neptune. I haven't got that kind of visual apparatus or equipment to help me along. So not all of our knowledge from testimony comes in the form that we might imagine, of us going up to people and asking them questions and they tell us something. Some of it's written down, some of it takes the form of diary entries. We overhear people saying things and come to learn like that. But nonetheless, it seems like if we take out the stuff that we know from testimony, it's hard to see how we know very much at all. Testimony is a really important way of finding things out, we might think. Think about the case where you got off the train in Edinburgh. I mean, how, you might wonder, do you know that you're in Edinburgh, assuming it's your first time being there? Well, you might look at it because the sign said so, but the sign's a form of testimony. It might be because you heard an announcement saying we're arriving into Edinburgh just beforehand. Announcements are a fairly obvious form of testimony, you might think. Testimony gets everywhere in our ability to find things out. And this is why it's really important to understand how it works. The puzzle with testimony, I guess, is the idea that, well, at least sometimes we do find things out by believing what people say. All of those things that I mentioned before are cases where testimony allows me or us to find things out that we wouldn't otherwise have been able to find out. We're successful in finding these things out. But we don't always find things out by believing what people say. Sometimes we might believe what people say and thereby fail to find things out. Sometimes people lie to us. It's in their interest to have us believe false things, so they tell us things that are false. And when we believe them, we don't find out anything at all. We're deceived. Other times people don't intend to deceive us, but they don't really know what they're talking about. They just speculate. And if we believe them, then that's not really a way of finding things out either. If I just guess at the number of moons that Neptune has and tell you, that doesn't seem like a way for you to find it out. Even if I guess right, that's not really a good way of finding these things out. So we don't want to believe just anybody in these kinds of cases. We want to work out the cases in which testimony is a good way of finding things out and compare them with the ways that testimony is not a good way of finding things out. And that'll let us understand how testimony works. That'll let us understand how we get to find things out by believing testimony. It looks like a lot of our beliefs, based on what other people say, amount to more than just guesswork. It doesn't seem like, even if I don't know how many moons Neptune has, it's not just because someone told me and that I haven't seen for myself. Testimony is a respectable epistemic source. It's a respectable way of forming beliefs. And the way that we're going to try and work our way through understanding how testimony is a respectable epistemic source or a way of finding things out involves having a think about some cases, some other cases to the one that we mentioned getting off the train, and thinking about, firstly, what we want to say about them, whether or not they involve people finding things out in a good way or not, and what exactly that shows us about a theory and an account of how believing other people gets us to find things out about the world. So without further ado, let's launch into our first kind of a case, our first two kinds of cases. We might meaningfully compare these two types of cases. So imagine a doctor performs a thorough medical test on you and informs you at the end that you have a particular medical condition. It seems like in this situation everything's going right, everything's going as it ought to go. You can find out by believing the doctor that you have that particular medical condition. Everyone seems to agree on that point. Compare that with the second kind of a case. Imagine a doctor appears to you to perform a thorough medical test and examination to find out whether or not you have a particular medical condition, but unbeknownst to you, you're not a doctor, you can't tell, the doctor's actually just guessing. The test is unreliable and doesn't work. But nonetheless, at the end, the doctor tells you, you have this particular medical condition. And you've seen them do what appears to be a test. It looks like it's less good in an important sense, but you don't know that it's any less good. Okay, so now we have two instances of beliefs formed on the basis of testimony. We have two instances of beliefs in what doctors say. The question is, in each of these cases, are we equally well off in terms of finding out what kinds of medical conditions we have, or you have? Well, according to the first kind of theory of testimony that we're going to look at, the answer's yes. Internalist theories of testimony take it that what matters for your finding out facts about the world is the reasons that you have that support the belief that you form. So in the case of the doctors, what makes it the case that you find out in that first case, in that good case, is because there are some things that you can say when someone says, well, why do you think you have this condition? Well, you can say, well, I saw someone who looked like a doctor to me and they did some tests and those tests looked pretty good and then they told me that I have this condition and that seems to mean that I have this condition. Reasons here are things that you can bring to bear in an argument. When someone says, why do you believe this? The idea is that your reasons are what comes out in response. And it's these reasons that support your belief. So the question is whether or not this internalist theory is right. The internalist theory just says a listener's belief is supported by her reasons for thinking that the speaker's testimony is true. That's what justifies belief, according to this kind of internalist story. The case of the two doctors comes from Friedrich Schmidt, and he argues that, look, intuitively, or it appears to us that in terms of justification in any interesting sense, these people are alike in the good case and in the case where the test isn't real. Both of them can bring to bear the same points, the same kinds of considerations, because things appear similar to them. In both cases, it appears to them like there was a doctor and the doctor did a test. Okay, in one case that's not actually true, but nonetheless, the listener doesn't know that. So according to internalist theories, yes, these two cases of doctors and patients are both alike. One of the nice things about internalist theories is they can capture a particular thought that we might think is really quite important for the epistemology of testimony. It seems like we can't just go about believing anybody. We need some reason to think that people are saying true things before we can go about believing them. We don't find out things just by looking in the right direction and having people say things at us. And this is really important, we might think, and internalists have a nice story of why this is the case. In the case where you got off the train at the beginning, it seems like the thing you're supposed to do is go and ask somebody, but not just anybody, not someone who's walking around and looking as confused as you are about everything. You're supposed to find somebody who looks, at least to you, like they know what they're talking about. Someone who's a relatively reliable looking source of authority on these kinds of matters. And the internalist theory has a really nice account of why it is that gullibility, just believing whatever people say when you don't have any reasons for doing these things, isn't a way of finding things out. according to the internalist story, you find things out because you have reasons for thinking that what people say are true. In the case of gullibility, you believe what someone says without any reasons for thinking that what they say is true. And this means that no case of gullibility is ever going to be justified by internalist standards, because internalists say you need these reasons and gullibility is just where you lack these reasons. So this is a nice point for internalist theories. They can explain how it is that the apparently obvious epistemic crime of gullibility is actually an epistemic crime. They can see why gullibility is incompatible with forming justified beliefs. Okay, let's leave internalism just for the moment and think about another pair of cases of a sort. Think about a case in which, first of all, an individual looks at a thermometer and the thermometer says it's 20 degrees, and the individual comes to believe, because they've looked at the thermometer, that it's 20 degrees. That's the first of these cases. The second, an individual confronts another individual, a speaker, and asks her what the temperature is, and the speaker says it's 20 degrees, and the listener comes to believe that it's 20 degrees. Both of these, it's worth being clear, look like perfectly respectable ways of finding things out. If you want to know the temperature, you should either consult a thermometer or consult someone that you think might know on these kinds of things. That seems fair enough. In both of these cases, it seems like there are epistemically good things going on. Someone, in trying to find something out, is doing what they're supposed to do, or at least something that they could reasonably be thinking is what they're supposed to do. Okay, so now we have two people doing what they're supposed to do. But are they, in all interesting respects, we might wonder? Well, one type of theory says, yes, they are. Reliabilist theories. Theories that think what matters for whether or not you've successfully found something out is how reliably you formed your belief, how easily you might have gone wrong in your inquiry, very roughly. And theories that think that what justifies a listener's belief, or what supports a listener's belief, what makes a listener's belief somehow good, is the fact that, well, believing that speaker is a reliable way of forming beliefs, think that in the case where you rely on an instrument and you rely on a speaker, epistemically speaking, things are just the same. It might be, of course, that one's more reliable than the other one, but let's leave that detail aside for the moment. Let's suppose that the speaker and the instrument are equally reliable. They're both likely to go right as often as each other. Of course, they won't go right for the same reasons. The thermometer might go right because it's in some sense sensitive to the ambient temperature. The speaker might go right because, well, they've looked at the thermometer or something like that. But assuming they're both equally reliable, equally likely to go right and wrong, so say reliabilist theories, there's no difference in the kind of thing that's supporting the beliefs in each of these cases. So the idea is that what happens here is that in the first case, an individual goes up to a thermometer and sees what it says and presumes that it will be reliable. Importantly, they presume rather than figuring out for themselves that it will be reliable. In the second case, they go up to a speaker and presume that the speaker's saying something reliable when they tell them the temperature. So the idea is that there's a presumption here of reliability. A presumption's important in this kind of case. It's different to what the internalist thinks goes on in these cases. According to the internalist, the idea was that, well, in cases of testimony, you tell me something and then I consider my background reasons and I think that, well, given that you said it, yes, it's likely to be true, or something like that. I construct my own story of why it is that you're saying something means that it's likely to be true. That kind of figuring out and constructing work doesn't go on this kind of reliabilist story that we're looking at here. Rather, it's kind of taken as a background assumption that the speaker, or in this case the instrument, is reliable. So the idea is that, in an important sense, there's less work going on. Rather than needing to tell an entire story about these things and why the speaker or instrument should be reliable, reliabilist theories of this kind just take it for granted that it is. And the idea is that this comes to connect up beliefs to the reliability of the processes involved in the formation of the belief. In the case of testimony, that's believing a speaker's testimony. Okay, so there's a reliabilist story about these cases of believing instruments and believing speakers. And it seems like the reliabilist story says, well, look, in the important, essential details, these cases are the same. You rely on something, in one case it's an instrument, in another case it's a speaker, and your belief is supported by reliability of the instrument or the speaker. The fine details come apart, but the basic epistemic shape of things is more or less the same. Thinking about those two cases, though, some theories think that, well, no, the two cases aren't alike in an important sense, or at least they don't have to be alike in any sense. At least they don't have to be alike in the most important sense. Thinking about transmission theories in the epistemology of testimony, these are a different type of theory altogether. Their idea is that when a listener comes to believe a speaker, the listener's belief can be supported by the fact that the speaker knows. The speaker has something that supports her belief, and that, whatever it is, comes to support the listener's belief. So the idea is that if I see that the time is 4:30 and I tell you that the time is 4:30, I have some justification for thinking that it's 4:30, I saw it. And you also have that same justification, according to transmission theories. At least that's something they think can happen. And the idea for transmission theories is that there's an interesting kind of presumption going on here. Like reliabilists, they're interested in presumptions rather than, usually, the idea that a listener has to figure out and tell their own story about why a speaker is likely to be reliable, or in this case, knowledgeable. The idea is that for transmission theorists, a listener might presume that a speaker's knowledgeable rather than merely reliable. They might think, well, this speaker knows what she's talking about as a background assumption and believe what she says based on that. And in these cases, we get the transmission of justification rather than a belief that's supported by reliability. So this gives us our three accounts of how it is that beliefs based on testimony come to be justified, how it is that we come to find things out. According to one way, we go around in the world, the internalist way, and look at people and figure out that they're saying true things based on our previous experience of people, or based on our reasons for thinking they might be telling the truth versus lying to us, or mistaken, or speculating, or any of those sorts of things. The idea is that we very much work it out for ourselves as listeners. We find some speakers who tell us some things, and then we work out that it's true for ourselves. Maybe using the fact that they said it, but we do the working out. According to the reliabilist theory, we walk around in the world relying on people. And when they're reliably saying true things, then we come to find out things about the world. And according to transmission theories, we don't rely on each other so much, but we take each other to be knowledgeable, or presume each other to be knowledgeable. Maybe we trust each other, something we'll come back to. And the idea is that when we do that, we come to know things or find things out about the world because the knowledge a speaker has, or the fact the speaker's found out about it, gets passed on to us as listeners. So this gives us our three accounts of a sort, and they say competing things. When we have our three accounts, it's worth seeing what might be said both for and against each of them. So let's think about our first case again, internalism. That was driven in a sense by thinking about the kind of two doctor cases. The idea was supposed to be that, well, you have this case in which someone thinks that their doctor's doing a normal, regular procedure on them, and indeed they are, and another case in which it looks all the same to a different listener, but the doctor's not actually doing any kind of procedure that's any good. And the internalist thought was that, well, these listeners are the same with respect to justification in any interesting sense. These listeners are alike because they're aware of the same things, so they have the same perspective on the world, and this means that they're alike with respect to the stuff that they found out, or their justification for their beliefs. That's supposed to be obvious, says the internalist. To my mind, it's entirely far from obvious. Indeed, I find it obvious that the reverse is true. Because one test is good, and another test is not, it strikes me as entirely obvious that one listener finds out in ways that the other one doesn't. And that the interesting kind of thing to focus on here is what's actually going on, rather than the two listeners and their perspectives on these things. So I think we should be entirely cautious in treating this internalist observation that these cases are clearly the same as obvious as it sounds, or as obvious as the internalist wants it to sound. Of course, the fact that, to me, the reverse is obvious isn't any more evidence that the internalist's wrong than their intuitions are that they're right. But nonetheless, even though I don't think that I have any particular God-given insight to working out what the right thing to say about cases is, I do think that there's enough there to cast doubt on the internalist story. After all, you might think, if they later found out that they were in different situations, they might then take it that this is evidence that they were never alike. So suppose you're in the case where you find out that the test that the doctor was doing on you is in fact not a good one. It seems to me like you might naturally think, well, I thought I'd found something out about my condition, but it turns out I hadn't. It was all just a giant con. And note the way of thinking there. It's not just, I thought I'd found something out and now I haven't found something out. It's that I thought I'd found something out and in fact I never had found anything out. It was all just a con. And the fact that there's an externalist story to be told there means I think we should tread carefully with this kind of thing. That's not decisive by any means, but it's worth being clear that sometimes we might think the intuition that the internalist is offering here is one that could be negotiable. The important thing for internalists is very much the idea that facts about a speaker, whether or not the speaker is knowledgeable or reliable or doing a proper test or any of those sorts of things, don't matter to a listener's epistemic state. They don't determine whether or not a listener's found something out about the world, unless the listener is aware of those facts. So unless the listener knows that the speaker is reliable or is aware that the speaker is reliable, the question of whether or not the speaker is reliable is a side issue for internalists. It might be relevant to other things, but it's not relevant to the question of whether or not the listener's found something out. This gets brought out in a case from Jennifer Lackey, who says, look, imagine your friend tells you that another person is a reliable authority with respect to birds. And then the other person tells you something about birds, but it's entirely unreliable, and it's false, in fact. She tells you that she saw an albatross, but she didn't see an albatross. It seems like in this case you have very good reasons for believing her. According to the internalist, things are going well here. After all, your friend, who you know and trust and have reasons to think are reliable, told you that this was a reliable speaker. But in fact she's not. And Lackey thinks that in this kind of case, we really shouldn't think that the listener's found anything out that's interesting. There's an important sense in which the fact the speaker doesn't know what she's talking about and is unreliable matters for a listener, whether or not they're aware of it. And if these observations are right, it looks like there's more going on in the case of testimony than the internalist can allow for. It looks like there's more going on than just the individual's reasons. Whether or not you found something out doesn't just depend on whether or not you have good reasons for thinking that you found something out. Of course, this opens a question of what should fill this kind of gap. But nonetheless, it seems that even when things are going well by internalist standards, there might be reasons for thinking that, on balance, things are not going well. We might think that there are more ways of things going right and wrong than the internalist has room to accommodate. So does reliabilism, the idea that beliefs were justified because of the reliability of the speaker, fare any better? Well, we might think that in an important sense, reliabilists are right. People can rely on each other in the way that they rely on instruments. But we might think that's not all there is in the epistemology of testimony. We don't just rely on each other in the way that we rely on instruments. We take it that speakers know things in ways that instruments don't. Okay, sometimes we say that instruments do know things. We say that the supermarket doors know when there's a person in front of them and they open appropriately. But when we talk about them knowing, there's an important sense in which we're not talking about the same thing as when we're talking about one of us knowing, a person knowing, or something like that. It seems like we take different attitudes towards people as well. We can make presumptions about people that we can't about instruments, and back to the literature on trust that I mentioned briefly earlier, it seems like when people go wrong, we blame them and feel resentful towards them in ways that we don't with instruments. If your car breaks down, well, you might feel resentful towards it in a sense, but you don't feel the same kind of resentment and betrayal if you did if someone offered to give you a lift but then didn't turn up, or something like that. So we might think that there's a worry here for reliabilism. The idea is that reliabilism is just too unsubtle and too narrow with its account of the ways in which we treat each other. It says that, look, we just go around relying on each other, and that's all there is to it. Our beliefs are connected to reliability because we rely on people and make presumptions about their reliability. But we might think there's more going on than that. We actually make presumptions about people's knowledgeability. And that's not just relying on them. That's not the kind of attitude we take towards a thermometer, say. We take it that the person knows that it's 20 degrees, not just that they're relying on someone to believe that it's 20 degrees at the right time and then say the right thing. So we might think that if the reason that our beliefs are connected to reliability is because we make a presumption of reliability, reliabilism can't give us the full picture here. It's not all about reliability, we might think. And this was where transmission theorists come in. So do transmission theories get on any better? Can we say, okay, well, it's not all about reliability, it is about finding knowledgeable people, presuming them to be reliable, and picking up their knowledge by transmission, or their justification for what they say by transmission. This, of course, does catch the idea that we make presumptions about people that we don't about instruments, on the other hand. And that much is fine. But we might think there are also worries about transmission. Think about a case where we have someone who is systematically confused about the world. They think that all triangular things are square, but they also lie all the time. So whenever they're thinking that something's square, they'll tell you that it's triangular. And the idea is that this person will reliably say true things. They'll reliably tell you that things are triangular when they are in fact triangular. It's just that they'll do it in a weird way. They'll see something triangular, believe that it's square, and tell you that it's triangular. Assuming that all of these processes are reliable, we have reliable testimony. And reliable testimony sounds like a good thing. It sounds like finding someone that's reliable should be a way of finding things out. The trouble is, it's not a way of finding things out that transmission theorists can make any sense of. Because in a case where someone sees something triangular, believes it's square, and then tells you that it's triangular, importantly, they don't know what they're telling you. Their justification for what they're telling you is non-existent. I mean, they think the object's square. So the idea is that in this kind of a case, we can't say a speaker's justification for what she says is transmitted to a listener. It's not. The speaker doesn't have any justification for what she says. And it's entirely obvious that where a speaker doesn't have any justification for what she says, a listener can't get any justification by transmission. So there's a problem here for transmission theories. Transmission theories, on the face of it, should want to say that someone who reliably says true things, believing them is a good way of finding things out. Believing reliable speakers is a way of finding things out about the world. But this kind of reliability can't be put in terms of transmission. So we have a worry here for transmission theorists. Okay, so let's take a step back for the moment before we head towards what I'd like to offer as a solution. We have three theories. We have internalism, we have reliabilism, and we have transmission. And we have objections to all of them, sadly. It seems like they all fail in their own particular ways. It's worth thinking for a moment about what we want a theory of testimony to do. And I think we want it to do two things. Firstly, and most obviously, we want it to say the right things about which beliefs are justified and which beliefs are not. In which cases does someone find something out, and in which cases doesn't someone find something out? But we don't just want that. We don't just want something that'll tell us which cases are knowing and which cases are not knowing, and which cases are justified and which cases are not justified, which cases are finding things out and which cases are not finding things out. We want to find some principled way of doing this. We want to find some way of explaining this that brings all these things together, that isn't just pointing at this case and going, oh, that seems justified and that doesn't. We want something that will in some way help us to understand what's going on, what's in common between all of these things. And with those two adequacy conditions on a theory in mind, I'd like to edge towards the idea that we might combine them somehow. So according to the kind of view I'd like to give, the idea is that there's truth in all of these theories. The internalist theory goes right in important ways, the reliabilist theory goes right in important ways, and the transmission theory goes right in important ways. Each of these three theories is indispensable to a complete account of testimony, we might think. And the idea is to try and bring them all together. So think about the case that was a problem for internalist theories. I mean, we might think it was the doctor cases, or we might think it was just a case where you have some reasons, but on the face of it, things don't seem to be going as well as you thought they were. Insofar as that's possible, that the internalist theory could be wrong because things could go well by internalist lights, but yet you still fail to find things out, this only shows you that internalism is incomplete as an account. I mean, it doesn't tell you that the internalist reasons are no part of the story, it just shows you that they're not all of the story. It shows you that there's clearly more to what's going on here than just the things internalist theories are interested in. Likewise, the idea for reliabilist theories was that there are particular presumptions that we make about each other that are not presumptions of reliability. The idea was that there are presumptions that we make concerning the idea that people know things. And reliabilist theories can't catch this idea because they think that we're connected up to reliability because we rely on each other. That much is fine, we might think, and it's a problem for reliabilist theories, but it doesn't show that we never rely on each other. I mean, the fact that we sometimes make presumptions about knowledgeability doesn't show that we never just make a presumption about reliability. We can, we might think, just rely on people in the way that we rely on instruments. And it's hard to see what might be wrong with that. So the problem with reliabilism, at least as I was offering, was not so much that it can't capture anything that's right. It was that it can't capture everything that's right. Like the internalist theory, it falls short because it fails to give us a complete account. Moving on to transmission theorists. Well, transmission theorists had a problem in that case where someone reliably says true things but doesn't know anything at all because they don't even have the right beliefs. But that doesn't show us that transmission is never the right thing to think about a case. That just shows us again that it's not always the right thing to think about a case. And the idea here is that by appealing to the idea that there might be truth in each of these views, we might be able to use each of these views to plug the gaps that the others miss. So the idea is that the kind of case where transmission theorists struggled will be explained nicely in terms of reliability. And the kind of cases where reliability struggle can be explained in terms of transmission. But if we want to go for this kind of approach, an approach that brings together all of these three things, we need an account of, well, when is it that each of these things are relevant? I mean, sometimes people will have reasons, but do their reasons matter? Sometimes a speaker will be reliable, but does that matter? Other times there'll be a knowledgeable speaker, but is that important here? Why and when are each of these considerations relevant? And this is important, because this is the bit where we start getting past the idea of just pointing at things and saying, oh, that's justified for that reason, and that's justified for that reason, and that's justified for that reason. What we need here is the principled bit. Any theory could tell us which cases were justified and which cases were not. The hard bit, you might think, is the principled bit, the bit where we try and work out exactly what's relevant when. The way that I suggest we might try and do this is by identifying different ways of responding to what a speaker says. I mean, at the core of all of these theories appears to me to be different ways of thinking about how we respond to people. So according to internalists, we respond to people, at least we're supposed to respond to people, by thinking about what they say and reflecting on the reasons that we have for thinking that what they say is true, and then coming to believe them or not believe them according to whether or not we have enough reasons for thinking that they're saying something likely to be true. According to reliabilist theories, we rely on each other by making presumptions about reliability in the way that we do about instruments, and according to transmission theories, we presume other people to be knowledgeable or speaking from a position of justified belief. So the idea here is that we might exploit these kind of conversational differences in the way that we respond to people, to underpin epistemic differences. And we might say that, well, when you make the kind of presumption of knowledgeability, what's relevant to your justification is the question of whether or not the speaker is knowledgeable. We have an explanation in terms of transmission. But on the other hand, if you don't make that presumption, if you presume that the speaker's reliable, what's relevant to your justification is the reliability of the processes involved in believing that speaker, whatever they may be. And lastly, if you decide, well, I'm not going to presume that the speaker's knowledgeable or reliable, but I'm going to presume nothing. I'm going to do the figuring out for myself. I'll take my beliefs in my own hands and I'll use my reasons to justify these beliefs. Well, these are when beliefs are justified, or otherwise, by internalist standards. And the internalist explanation goes, right, so I say. The idea here is that we can get all three parts of a theory and we can fit them together based on the idea that what determines your justification as a listener is how you respond to the speaker. And in doing that, I think we can sort out how there's truth in each of these views and fit them together in a way that isn't just saying, well, sometimes it's reliability and sometimes it's transmission and sometimes it's internalism. The idea is that it's reliability in these cases where someone is relying on someone else. It's internalism in these cases where a listener's taking her belief in her own hands and figuring things out for herself. And it's transmission where the speaker's presumed to be knowledgeable. So to wrap things up, it's worth bringing ourselves back to that initial thought that we had, that the point of a theory of testimony is to explain as much of our justified belief as possible. I mean, I started out by pointing out that, look, really quite a lot of our beliefs seem to depend on testimony in some sense. And that if testimony is off the table as a way of finding things out, we really don't know very much at all. Since that was how I decided to motivate these things, you might think an important part of the theory needs to be explaining quite a lot of this stuff. It's no use saying, okay, well, loads of our beliefs depend on testimony, but I'm only going to explain this really small bit. That wouldn't make for a very interesting theory. Nonetheless, I think that the theory here can do the kind of explanatory work I set out for it. It can explain how it is that a lot of our beliefs depend on testimony. It can explain how there are really diverse ways of believing what people say. And the idea is that in appealing to these kinds of diverse ways of believing each other, we can find a theory of testimony that will explain a lot of our beliefs. It'll bring together different types of explanations based on testimony. And it'll do this in a way that finds a common theme to them all. It'll appeal to conversational differences and use those to support epistemic differences. And the thought is that if we take all of these things, we'll somehow get ourselves towards a complete epistemology of testimony.